Good morning. Continuing the summary and review, this conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We are on page 1428 in volume 3 and discussing very fundamental topic in the relationship between ourselves, that is the human mortal being, with God, the immortal and immutable, the divine. And discussion is around a core element that defines us as humans is our midas. Obviously, there's seichel, intelligence, but midas is our life experiences, which is all about feelings, relationships, interactions, changes and shifts. You ask any average person, how many moods do you go through? Not your lifetime, even in a day. It's not just about mood changes. It's just that emotions are subject to shinui in every possible way. That's what they're about. When you're with your family, you're in a certain certain mood or a certain emotional state. You go to work, you meet strangers, you meet people you know. We're constantly being stimulated and affected by our environment and by the people around us. Whereas by God, you can't apply that concept at all. So in a way, if you think about it, it's two different realities that ever the twain shall meet, as they say. Where do they meet? What's in common between them? And yet, Hashem created the human being in the divine image, and God himself, though he's beyond any image and structure, and Ani Hashem Leishanisi, like I said, immutable, unchangeable, and all of that, and yet, like we learned, because of Shleimus HaAtzmos, Kishem sheyesh lekeche bebilti bal gvul, kach yesh lekeche begvul. Just as he has the power to express himself in an infinite fashion, which we don't have, humans, he also has the power to express himself in a finite fashion. Keche begvul, like he brought from the Avedis HaKedesh. And as such, from there, because God desired to have a dira b'tachtenim, which means not a dira for us, just for us to have a civilized world where we live and coexist in a peaceful and harmonious fashion, but a dira lo yizbarach, that this world, this material world, with all its fragility, with all its changes and shifts, should become a home, an eternal home. So until Mashiach comes, yes, we don't have a Beis Hamikdash Nitzchi, an eternal Beis Hamikdash, but once Mashiach comes, Mikdash Adnei Ken Yeder, the third Beis Hamikdash, will be eternal, and it'll be a dira elei yisbarach, a permanent home. Where? In a place that's not permanent, like we discussed yesterday, bringing the immutability of the divine into a mutable and ever-changing world, to experience in the moments and in the spaces of existence, and existence is defined by time and space, something which is beyond time and space. That's essentially, in different simple English, what this process is about. As a result of that, God then said, so I want to engage with this existence. It's not removed because I want it to be a dira for me. So if you look, for example, in Chumash, when you read Pasha Truma and the subsequent chapters, later in this book of Shmos that we're going to read later, in a few weeks from now, you see an elaborate and complex description of a Mishkan with all the parameters and all its dimensions, as well as the vessels within the Mishkan. All these are defined and confined and limited finite spaces where God says, this will be where I will dwell. To the point that Shlomo HaMelech actually wondered, Shamayim v'shmei Shamayim lo yichal kalucha, heavens and heavens of heavens cannot contain you, afki abayis hazeh, this small little abode, this small structure can contain you. And Hashem said, read that very verse, but not as a question, but as a statement, b'nechusa. Even though Shamayim v'shmei Shamayim, heavens and heavens of heavens can't contain me, afki abayis, this house, yes, that's what I want. To the point that we have by the Aron, Malkama Aron, Eina Min Amida. literally the joining of space and beyond space in one. So what you have is that God himself defined what kind of mishkan he wants. It's not a man-made, it's a man-made building in the sense that we built it, humans built it, but it's God that defined what he wants there. So this structure is essentially a divine structure, like he said here, if you want to put it in different terms, it's koiche begvul. This is how he wants to define and to manifest his bligvul in this structure. So in the context of midas, it means that by us, midas is what defines a human being, for good or for bad, our constant, you can call it, I don't want to use the word frailty, maybe a good word, maybe it's not the right word, but basically our temporal life and personalities, changing, shifting, affected by things around us. So you can't say that about midas. Like we learned that when it says then that the Chekri Yisrael say there's no midas lamaila, in that sense, like we learned in volume 1, is emes. They're not affected. God is not affected by the shifts and by experiences. However, to say there's no midas lamaila, you can't say either, because God shows koiche begvul, like he said, to manifest in chanun v'rachum and so on, in the 10 spheres, the 10 attributes, like calls them midas lamaila and atzmim, loishem mispalim in azulas. It's not because of an effect from another, or a relationship or an interaction with another. That you can't apply to God in those higher levels. However, and because he's toiv be'etzem, like we learned, from that comes midas hachesed, and due to mitzad hashlemus, and due to his ability to gvul, he comes from that koyach hagvura, midas hagvura, I should say, and the shorsh ma'atzmi comes from his capacity to reveal, his capacity not to reveal. So it's all about God's capacities. So he's creating essentially these attributes that of course emerge because God has every capacity to do anything. I mean, he doesn't use the word here shemis, but in a way this is the beginning where God says, here are the descriptions, the definitions that will later become names that when you call me by that name, you will draw that attribute out of me, so to speak, as we learned more at length in the previous pages. And from Rachmim Ma'atzmim, Kel Moli Rachmim comes the Mistayif Midas HaRachmim. However, here comes the dilemma. That's still so fine. So we've bridged one aspect between our existence and God, that there are Midas Lamaila and there's Midas Lamata. Because now we do say that the God chose to manifest, and this would be not, of course, in the levels before the 10 hidden spheres. It's all the way in the levels once God says, I want to have 10 hidden spheres. That's just conceptual spheres. That itself is rooted from his capacity to reveal, capacity to conceal, as we just discussed, and the combination of both, which is Teferes. It's another interesting note to make, how he defines Teferes as the combination of Tzimtzum and Gilui, how they work together, Chesed and Gvura. But in the root, it's not Chesed and Gvura, it's God's capacities, but it's still immutable. It's still Ani Hashem Le'Shenisi. So we still have an issue, the bridge between us and God. Fine, we found a meeting place that our chesed can relate to God's chesed. But our chesed is affected by a spilus of another, and God's chesed is not. So the next step is that the spheres then come down to a lower state. Through tzimtzum and concealment, after the tzimtzum, ultimately in Atzilus, after the development of the spheres in Ak, and then Akudim, 10 energies in one container. Think of like the development of a fetus. In Atzilus is a full-blown structure where you have Ches, Chochmeh, Bina, Dat, Chesed, all the way through Malchus, including the Midas. So what is the? So Atzilus adds another dimension. It adds that Tzimtzum Mad, that there is Ispilus. And he explains Ispilus not that God is stimulated or affected by others like we are, but Ispilus means that the Midas now have taken on tangible sensation. The words he used, he said these words. I think it's critical, even though it's in a parentheses. He said, what does Hergish mean? In Ispilus, hainu b'chinas ha-hergish. So Ispilus means that there's an actual tangible feeling. The Midas we spoke about before is a Midas without Ispilus means there's no Hergish. It's God's capacity. It's like he has faculties. Just as, I mean, as an example, a human being has faculties. Doesn't mean they in any way affect you. When you're asleep, you have faculties. Even when you're awake, doesn't mean you're conscious of them. But then there's the emotions take on an actual personality. That there's actually an experience of chesed. So he says it's like al derech by Adam hergesh atzmei. There's a sense. So lifnei tzimtzum, or in the higher levels, you can say there's midas as God's so-called an expression of God's powers and capacities. Now in Atzilus, midas have taken on an actual experience. It's a feeling. However, as he explained, he says these words: it's not a ispilus because God is affected by the creations. Then he said, Hainu lias agili ela nevroim. I know I interpreted it one way yesterday, but I'll just say there's two ways you can interpret that next line. It could either mean that Hainu lias agili nevroim, meaning that it's not that it's stimulated by nevroim, but it's agili to nevroim. That's one way to teach it. Or you could say Hainu lias agili el nevroim, that this ispilus is connected to nevroim, and that's not what it is. The loisha nevroim goydimim, I think it's the first interpretation. It makes more sense in reading it. But regardless, so what we've achieved there, that the midas have now become personalities. They've become tangible, and you can sense them. If you remember, we spoke about Oisius. So remember, he said there's a level of Oisius. Not only you feel them like letters of speech, you sense the letters, or letters in writing even more so. It's very tangible. In thought, there's also letters, but he said you don't always sense them, because the thought itself dominates. The Ur is more powerful than the Kalim. But then there's a level, he said, not only they're not discernible, they're not yet even shaped, because the Ur does not yet come down into real Oisius. So Atzilus, however, is the Midas have become Midas. They're still divine Midas. Meaning it's all divine, but it's Midas that are not just Lifnei Tzimtzum type of Midas, God's tools, God's capacity, God's power, shleimus. Here we're talking already, they've come into actual chesed. There's an experience of chesed. However, it's not yet impacted by us. In the parentheses, he qualifies, ube'emes, b'seidus ha'nevroim is chesed aleim. That the fact is we actually can also stimulate them. But he says that, let's leave for later. He's going to discuss that later.
Can you take a question?
Not middle of a sentence, obviously. So let me finish the whole topic, and before I continue learning, I'll take questions. So anyway, so it's only mitzad. So therefore, it's not coming mitzad ispilus of another, but it is ispilus in the context that's become a tangible midah. Okay. I mean, in the example of a development of a fetus, you could say the first stage when the new life is conceived, you have one cell. You can't talk about midas there altogether. It's encompassed in there because that one cell will split and ultimately become a full developed child with midas and a full structure. But there, you could say it's still all in a very concentrated and very amorphous, nebulous state. But let's say 6 months after the second trimester of a pregnancy. So the child is already developed. You can also say the personality of the child is developing, and there are midas. There are sensations the child is already feeling at some point. Not sure at what stage they've determined that, but it doesn't matter, at some point. But you can't call them midas that relate with other people. The child is inside the womb. It's not interacting with anyone. But to say that there aren't any feelings, of course there are feelings. A child can, there are different things the fetus goes through in that stage. Then, once a child is born, it's interacting with the world around it. And there, of course, the child definitely has the spilus of midas in a real relationship level. So Atzilus is the middle place. It's no longer just nebulous midas as in the powers of God. It's already developed, and it's a hergish. There are actual feelings, but it's not yet feelings that interact with existence yet in a direct fashion, meaning stimulated by existence. That's what Atzilus. Ki'im mitzad ha'atzmus. So 1 second. Omnam mispal says enemin of this. Ki mitzad ha'atzmus, hainu mitzad ha'kavona el yena. So it's still mitzad ha'kavona el yena that God wants to have these midas, So still, what dominates is that it's God's powers. However, these powers have become tangible in a way. Tangible spiritually, obviously, not physically. Okay. And now the difference is, so what's the difference between Atzilus and higher than Atzilus? So he says, there you can't even talk about them in any form of feeling, of actual sensation. And what's the Ispilus? The Hergish. That's due to the fact that the midas came through a tzimtzum, as I explained. So the tzimtzum has diminished the intensity of the oir. So now the kelim of Atzilus take on more shape and form, and therefore they give it body, and they give it substance, and they give it hergish, the midas. And that's the difference between these. So we've gotten a little closer with the divine energy. The divine midas are something more in common with us because they do have a feeling. What's still missing is the area of Hispilus min Azulas. Do we really interact in the way, like when it says that Hashem spoke to Moshe like a person would speak to a friend? Can we talk about the divine in that context as well? So we'll get there. That's going to be discussed in the next stage as these midas become more and more reliable, because it's still Atzilus. We haven't talked about the midas of Biy'a, of Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, and that interaction. So we'll get to that. One more thing I wanted to add was one more thing in the summary. In the parentheses, the Gam Yashlemer, just wanted to sum that up. So he spoke about Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, how they are in their root, Gilui, Helam, and the combination of both, like he says in the parentheses. And he said, Gam Yashlemer, that Chesed is the experience of Chesed on that level, all the way as it's coming from the Atzmim, the Mailahin Atzmi, the Midas says they're coming from God's capacity. So he said, that's the level of bitla and yichud b'hakavon al yenu b'chinas hagilui. So in other words, you're focusing not on the gilui itself, or on the chesed or on the gvura. You're focusing what is God's intention in why He's revealing. What is God's intention in why He's concealing, and what's God's intention teferes when He combines both. That the tzimtzum is b'shvil hagilui and the gilui is b'shvil hatzimtzum. So in other words, the focus is not our experience of chesed or gvura. It's the godly interest. What is God's interest in giving chesed? That is the parentheses. So Avodah, basically, if you want to apply this in Avodah, these different levels would be that the highest level is a complete focus. Well, you know what? Let me go from the lower level. The more the midas relate to us, the more it's our experience, and it's on our terms, like we've learned a number of times. So we haven't yet gotten to the level it's completely on our terms, but Atzilus is already a hergish of chesed. So you could say it's a chesed that relates to the Nevraim. However, it's not coming from the Nevraim. It's God's ability to show chesed, but it's taken on tangible form. When you're talking about the midas as they are lamaila, higher than Atzilus, there the focus is simply what is God's intention, what is God's interest in this manifestation into midas, into chesed, gvura, teferes. So it's like I pointed out in Avodah, for example, when you say the mitzvah, you do a mitzvah, say asher kedeshanu b'mitzvesu v'tzivanu lahadlik ner Chanukah, for instance, or laniach tefillin. So the first part of the bracha is focusing that God sanctified us in this mitzvahs. There's no distinction one mitzvah to the next. It's all about God. God wants us to do this mitzvah. It's God's ratzon. Then the ratzon takes on shape and form. You're lighting a Chanukah candle, or candles, or you're putting on tefillin, or you're lighting a Shabbos candle, or all the other mitzvahs. So what's the focus? Is the focus on the specific mitzvah that you're doing and the details? Let's put it this way, as I said yesterday, on the mitzvah as the physical structure of time and space in this world is connecting with the divine, or you're focusing on the divine that wants to enter into this time and space. So it's two different kavanas. Both are legitimate and both are necessary, but they are 2 points. One is you're focusing on God's intention in all of this, like the bigger plan, so to speak. Yes, in Chesed and Gvura. And the other, you're focusing on the specific details, which are critical as well, because the mitzvah has to be done in a very specific way. You're lighting Chanukah candle, it's not a different mitzvah. But they're all about joining and interfacing between divine and existence, depending where the focus is more on the details or the focus is on the divine will or the divine interest and kavanah within it. Okay, So that's where we reached. We're literally in the middle of the topic, but I thought it was a good place to stop, and we'll continue from here. But I'll take any questions now.
Yeah, my question is, after the Tzimtzum, the midos are no longer atzmim. Is that correct? I mean, and in order for them to become atzmim, it has to be their our avoida down here. And when we then concentrate, like for example, on Shema, and we get to understand
Well,
Yichud Tata, Yichud
you lost me a little there. I'm not sure. How did you jump to Shema and Avodah here? He didn't talk about that at all.
Well, we ultimately the goal is to make this world a dira and to bring Asmus himself into this world. But until, let's say, La'asi Lavo, that we're not going to experience the full the Asmus of the Midas. I ask me. I'm not saying it's so. I'm asking.
Okay, so let me answer your question. So first of all, the word Atzmim does not mean Atzmos. Atzmim means it's coming from within him, not stimulated by another. If you read the full sentence, he says, Hein Atzmim loishem ispoilim min azulas. By us, emotions, even though we do have emotions in our soul, chesed gvura, but they're mispoilim min azulas. Like we spoke, that was the question that he asked. How could you say that lamaila? Because ani Hashem leishanisi. So his answer is that midas lamaila hein atzmim means they are coming from his very core, like he continues to explain, from his shleimus.
Please continue forward.
But that's Lamaila. I'm talking about
Lamaila. There's outside noises here. Can everyone just mute if you don't mind?
I'm sorry. I'm in an airplane. That's my problem. I'm flying.
Okay, so why don't you mute while I answer, and then you'll unmute. Fine. So Atzmim here means it's coming from his core, but it's not. We're not talking about Atzmos per se right now, because Atzmos is higher than 10 hidden spheres. Even it's higher than Midas altogether. So we're saying it's coming from his very core. Like he says, Tov be'etzem. And then those midas then develop in Atzilus, they become so-called full-bodied, where there's a sensation, a feeling, and so on.
Right. But my question is the midas in Atzilus, they're not, I understand they're coming from Atzilus, but they're not Atzmi'im because they're tangible. And so as I understand it, once they become,
But that's not what he's saying here. That's not what he's trying to say here. They are coming, the Atzmi means here that it's coming from within him and not stimulated by another. That's the key thing. Now, in Atzilus, he also said it's not stimulated by another. It's also coming from him. So who says that they're not Atzmim in Atzilus?
That's exactly my question.
So I wouldn't say that. That's why I'm saying Atzmim doesn't mean Atzmus. Atzmim means it's coming from within. As a matter of fact, now that I read it, he actually says this is Ki'im Sada Atzmus. And he's talking about Atzilus here. He says, Haspilus Zeus in Atzilus, he says, let's just read the exact last language. Just a second, please. So I'm going to find the exact language to make sure I got it right. Yeah, Hamidus Kamoshem Ba'atzilus and B'chinas Ispilus. That's what changes them from the midas as they are coming from the Atzmim. Ispilus explained is Hergish. They're defined, they're tangible. But he says, Ispilus is not from the Nivroim. Ki'im, he says clearly, Ki'im mitzada Atzmos. And mitzada Hayakavona El Yena. The difference is, before the Tzimtzum, or higher than Atzilus, it's not Ispilus means, it's not defined, or you could say sensed, and Atzilus is Ispilus. That's the distinction he made.
Okay, I understand. So it can still be Mitzad Atzmus in Atzilus, but because it's not coming from our efforts, it's still coming from him, and that's what makes them Atzmi, even though the midos are in Atzilus. Did I understand that correctly?
Yep.
Okay.
And the parenthesis he qualified. There is an element that are avoida be'emes. Yiseidus and Nevroim is chassid. Our Yiseidus causes God to give kindness, but he said that he'll discuss later. So we'll get to that. Right now, we haven't. He just qualified that in the parentheses.
Now I remember we're going to get to how Malchus is like a gateway for us to be somehow tickle the upper realms. Excuse my use of the word tickle, but just to touch it, to stimulate. And I am at a disadvantage because I don't have the words in front of me. I'm on an airplane, so on my phone.
Okay.
But am I correct that we can effectuate?
I don't want to speak about it. We're going to learn that later. Okay. Right now, this is what we've learned. And I made it clear that we're going to talk about the next stage. Remember, we didn't talk about midas in Biy'a as they come down lower and lower levels.
Yeah.
So far, we talked about these two levels. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. So continuing on, around halfway down the page, 1428, 1428. The line that begins with Zeh mepnei shamidas Atzilus boim ayidei tzimtzum. So we'll continue from there, the parentheses, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. It says, U'kamoishin is barely ill. Like we learned earlier, ha'hefesh ben Eir la'Atzilus. So when you say Eir, the divine energy, and we say Atzilus, which is divine emanation, what's the difference between the two? So he's going to say it's the difference that we're discussing here, higher than Atzilus and Atzilus. The Eir who are called Batzmusei rather. When you say Eir, light, you're not talking about its definitions and its manifestations. You're talking about Kol Batzmusei, it's the way it's encompassed in Atzmus, the power to reveal. Or even if there's revelation, it's within what we called earlier, generally, Eir Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum is Eir HaKol Batzmusei. There itself, there are levels, as we discussed. Okay. V'Atzilus u'sheyotza chutz la'atzmusei. Kavyachol. Atzilus, now, the divine manifestation has gone, so to speak, outside of Atzmusei. And what does he mean by outside of Atzmusei? Nothing is outside of Atzmus. However, it's taken on its own shape and form. Like I spoke, that's why I gave the example of the fetus. When you're talking about the one cell, or even prior to that, the concept of conception, if you wish, there, you're talking about everything is in such a nebulous state, everything is purely Eir. It's all how it's all encompassed in the source. Once the child has been conceived, when the cell has been conceived, it's still all in one cell, but once it develops, that would be like chutz la'atzmusei, because it's now developing outside of its core. So in other words, the earlier stages, as we've learned before the Tzimtzum, it's all within the Godhead, so to speak. Within God's field of energy, divine field of energy, you have these different levels that he is envisioning, developing, however you want to explain it. Conceptually, the concept of a concept, like we spoke, the shemos, but all within the core. Atzilus is an actual world. It's an actual domain. It's a spiritual world, spiritual dimension, but here you have a developed, if you want in the analogy, fetus that has faculties. It's all divine, and it's not stimulated by something outside of it, but it's in that sense, it's kavyochel chutz la'atzmusei. So the midas have now taken on this form of sheib chutz la'atzmusei v'hainu al yidei tzimtzum. And how did that take place? Because the tzimtzum diminished the intensity of the Eir to allow for this presence and this definition to emerge. So like before the Tzimtzum, if you talk about 10 hidden spheres, there are no spheres there. They're completely subsumed. They're not even subsumed. They haven't yet even developed. It's all before the Tzimtzum. It's in God's consciousness, so to speak. But in Atzilus, there are actual midas. So he calls that Kavyochel Chutz La'atzmusei relative to Eir. So that's Eir and Atzilus. These two levels that we're discussing now. V'zeu shekosav. And this is what it says. Havaya chanun v'rachum. Then we say that God is chanun, v'rachum, is kind, and is compassionate. The b'chdei sheyeh chanun v'rachum. And these are the midas l'maylo. In order for him to be chanun v'rachum, zeu ha'idei havaya. So he's explaining the havaya chanun v'rachum. How does he become chanun v'rachum? Havaya is chanun v'rachum. It comes through havaya, shayud, hu b'chinas hatzimtzum. So the yud of avai, yud ke vav ke, is the level of tzimtzum. That tzimtzum is what causes the chan v'rachum to manifest. Now, clearly here, he seems to be talking about Atzilus, but you could also apply it before the tzimtzum also, in the sense that to go from a state that's completely beyond midas to midas also requires, but most likely he's talking already chan v'rachum as they are in b'chinas hispalus hergish. But regardless, it's through tzimtzum. That's what causes the energy to be somewhat recedes, somewhat diminished, allowing for the midah to take on an experience, so a tangible and a sensation, which allows us to relate to it. Again, going back to the fetus, the midas the way they are in the one cell, you can't have a relationship with that. The child has to develop and have a full-bodied experience, become a human being, then you can have an emotional relationship with it. So Kavyachal Amayla, the same idea. The midas are taking on now shape and form, but it's still not the spilus min azulas. The spilus here, he means is hergish. So it's taken on that they're actual feelings, but there's not yet a relationship with a relationship. Well, there's a relationship, but it's not a one that's stimulated by nivroim. As of now, that's what we've learned until now. Then he's going to continue now. We're going to continue this discussion. But let me stop if there are any questions on anything I just said. Well, continuing, ulachein. Now, as we move downward, so to speak, in the Shtalshalus, ulachein hamidas he begin shaychus le'elam is Biy'a. So now he's introducing the worlds of Biy'a. Now that the midas have taken on a shape and form, and there's a tangible sensation, but that causes them to have a relationship now, a shaychus, some type of connection to the worlds of Biy'a. Before that, to talk about the midas as they are coming from the core itself, what do you call them? Atzmim, Leishem Ispal Min Azul, is they're still in a state that are God's capacities. It's Atzilus that can allows us to have the connection to Biy'a. Ukamesha Kosev Zcheir Rachamecha V'Chasadecha Kime'elam Hema. Remember, it's invoking or evoking. Rachamecha v'chasadecha, your compassion and your kindness, ki me'elam. So me'elam is teaching here that they're already coming into an existence of a world, referring here to the worlds of Biy'a. That's looks like the way he's interpreting it. One second. Excuse me. So, as I discussed earlier, Atzilus allows for the next step, which is that it's going to begin to have connect shaykhs to the worlds of Biy'a. So we'll get to shortly. Rak, however, still with the qualification, as repeating what he said before, Shamidus ein ze b'chinas ispilus mitzad hanevroim. All right. Excuse me. A small cold. But the spilus is not mitzad hanevroim. It's not due to the nevroim. It's all due to his wanting to manifest in these emotions. The ein b'hem shinei klal. And even Atzilus, there's not a shinei at all, because they're not affected by anything. They're affected simply, these are a result of God choosing to manifest, not because. And to go back to the example, the fetus, even in the final trimester, doesn't have a relationship with anyone. I mean, you could say a relationship with its mother, but not in any direct way. It's not like the child is reacting to someone else's emotions, but the child has emotions already. Again, it's a pure example that's not in any way comparable, but just to give us a little sense of how emotions can be developed, but not yet interact or stimulated by another. And obviously with a child, it's a human being, a mortal, that's shinui, there is shinui there. Whereas Lamaylu, there's no shinui. So you see, but it's moved into at least in a place where it has a shaykhus to Biy'a. Ki'im, I'm sorry, that's that. Furthermore, v'gam p'chinas hashpos hamidus, and additionally, also the transmission of these midas as they are in Atzilus. As they are, they cannot be received into Biy'a. They've come closer to the experience of Biy'a, but you can't say that they can be received in Biy'a. Because as they are in Atzilus, they're still like a level of Ein Sof, relatively speaking. Like he spoke earlier, if you remember, by the way, when he spoke about the cosmic digestive system, he said the way it's in Atzilus, it's still Ein Sof, and is the like the piece of meat that's not been broken down. Just want to see the exact expression. And it's the angels, the malachim, that break it down, that can be able to come down into gvul. Where was exact? I think it was on page 1426. Let me just, yeah, right here. Here we are. Lakus is Ein Sof mamish. Ein Sof, Atzilus is Ein Sof l'gaba Biy'a. He said that clearly on page 1426. And then, in order to strengthen and to sustain the Shamas HaMalachim, you have to break it down through the Kelim HaMavadim, the digestive system. So Atzilus itself, therefore, is still in a state of Ein Sof compared to Biy'a. So it's moved closer, yes, than the first level of Midas, as we call them, as they are the Mailam Atzilus, but they're still above Biy'a. V'achesed Atzilus ein ze b'chinas hachesed de Biy'a. And when you say chesed of Atzilus, kindness in Atzilus, as much as it's become tangible sensation and feeling, it's not the chesed of Biy'a. V'hu b'chinas bli gvul. And relative to Biy'a, it's still in the form of bli gvul without finite, because it's a divine energy. Like it says in some places, ein sof lishpashtuse. The chesed in Atzilus can go forever. It doesn't have any limits. It is chesed, not gvura, but it's still a divine entity, whereas in Biy'a, it becomes a finite chesed. Oh, okay. Stop here. Okay. So you see how he's moving very methodically from higher than Atzilus, in the root of where the midas originate from, his capacity. It's now moved to Atzilus. And now in Atzilus, Shaykhis Biy'a, but it's still above Biy'a. So now the question is there anywhere where there is actually Hispilus, where you can say God is affected by us? Because till now we've been talking on Yashem Leishanisi, just the difference between the Leishanisi higher than Atzilus and the Shanisi and Leishanisi of Atzilus. But both of them are immutable. So now he's going to speak about where Hispilus actually does take place in our relationship with God, where Maisa Tachtenim, our actions, actually stimulate and in some way Kavyochel affect godliness. That it's the level he's going to say is Malchus of Atzilus, which of course is the bridge into Biy'a. But before I continue, I'll stop again if anybody wants to ask anything. I want to go very deliberately here.
Just a quick curiosity question. There's chesed of bligvul. Is there such a thing as gevura of bligvul, or that's not possible because
Gevura bligvul too. Absolutely, it is possible. We said l'mayla ad ein ketz in the Bas Lagan. It means God can conceal himself endlessly. That's number one. Number two, gevura from the power. If you talk about it from power, the gevura has power and strength. It's also the same idea. Gvura, an endless type of gvura. We don't, in Biy'a, it's not endless. In Atzilus, they all have a certain element of infinity within them. But it's infinity within the finite structure of chesed or gvura. Gvura is not chesed, and chesed is not gvura.
Because gvura seems like the opposite direction. You can conceal yourself and then you're concealed. How is it bligvul?
No, because these concealments are infinite. They can be infinite concealments. We're not talking about human here. We're talking about the ability of concealment, the ability of withdrawing or restraining. And Gvura has many aspects to it as well. Gvura and din, there's different ways to explain it. Same thing you could say about Gilui. There's Gilui, and how much more can you reveal?
Depths, but concealment, once it's concealed, that's it. Goodbye.
Not correct. You could say the same, once it's revealed, it's revealed. Why don't you say the same thing about revelation?
But you could learn more and understand more and go
And
deeper.
you can conceal more. When you're talking about an entity that's infinite, it's an infinite levels of concealment because there's no limit. Same infinity can go both directions.
Thank you.
You're sure. Now he says, "Umashashayach bebchinas ispilus, hu bebchinas Malchus, Atzilus moker de Biy'a." Where can you say ispilus not just as a hergish, that there's an actual sensation, but there's an actual ispilus, a relationship impact. In other words, a reciprocal type of ispilus that's stimulated or aroused or awakened from one to another. That you could say in Malchus of Atzilus, which is the moker, the source of the worlds of Biy'a, Yitzir, Asiya. So now we move down to Malchus, the end of Atzilus, as we're moving into the next dimension of Biy'a. And he explains this now. It's going to be an explanation. The next few pages is to discuss this Ispilus that we're talking about. And then we'll see how in the Ispilus of the Shinuyim, of the Midas Lamata, we slowly can retrace the steps to the Midas of Atzilus, and then all the way to the Midas that he calls Atzmim, the Midas as they are, coming out of God's capacity, and not in any form of actual tangible or sensational, it's not a good word, sensational. Midas that are sensed in the sense of tangible fashion. Ukiyadua, as it's known, Shamalchus Nikra Asad de Mishtana. It's an expression from Zohar, I believe. Asad in Aramaic means mokim, location. Asad, it's a domain that's Mishtana, that changes. It's subject to change. So here we're suddenly speaking about the word change. Till now we're talking Loishan, you see, but by Malchus we say Asad de Mishtana. The Sham Negeya Maisa Tachtenim. There, it's Negeya, Maisa Tachtenim, meaning our actions, our service below. Till now, we were speaking, our Maisa Tachtenim does not affect above. And the Midas are not due to our reaching to God, but due to God himself reaching to us, so to speak. As he wants to, based on based on his intentions and his kavanah. Now we're saying Maisa Tachtenim into Negeya. Now, the word Negeya is an interesting word. Negeya means it affects. It's important to him. And Ma'aseh Tachtenim has an impact there. Like it says in Zohar Vayechi, page 121, the bottom of first page. Bepiras Sheshanas HaAmokim. So Sheshanas HaAmokim is a pasuk, I believe in Shir HaShirim and maybe other places. Sheshan is a rose. Amokim, the rose in the tunnels or in the valleys, I should say. Amokim, not tunnels. That's my mistake. Sheshan is Amokim, the rose in the valleys. So what does that level refer to? The Mefarish, the Zohar explains Sheshana Loshen Shinui. So Sheshana, though it means rose, it also comes from the word Shinui, change. In other words, it's subject to change. Because like a rose that changes its colors, sometimes beautiful and sometimes not so. Like you can see, a rose as it begins to wither, its colors change. So you see, a rose is subject to and is in the world of change, and Shoshana is the level of Malchus. So I guess Amokim would probably mean referring to Malchus in the valleys. Malchus as it comes downward in the valley, and that is the level of Sheshana Loshen Shinui. So you see there's a level where there is Shinui. V'hu, and what does that mean specifically in Maisa Tachtenim? Ki Maisa Tachtenim, Again, Maisa Tachtenim means our actions in the lowest of worlds, below. Well, I didn't read the tone right. But who? And those changes happen, Kifi Maisa Tachtenim. They are what affects, what causes these things to change, what causes this change? Kifi Maisa Tachtenim. It's commensurate to the actions, our actions below. Kachi Ashpa Mebchinas Malchus. So in reciprocating to that, and commensurate to that, will be the Ashpa from Malchus. So in other words, Malchus is not just, like we learned earlier, it's just Ashpa of Chesed, coming from God's capacity to have Chesed and kindness. Here we're saying that Malchus is affected by our actions. Our actions is what causes Malchus to be mashpia in whatever fashion it's mashpia. So just to use a very quick, not even perfect, far from perfect example. Let's say you have a relationship with your teacher, and he's teaching you an idea. And the idea is a very profound idea, and the teacher you see has developed it, and he's really mastered it. The student has not yet mastered it. He's listening. So the student may ask a question and try to get more explanation, but he clearly sees there's a whole subject here that he has to receive. So though the student may ask the question, this question is not going to shift or change the concept that needs to be explained by the teacher. Then there's a second state where the student and the teacher are interacting, and the question of the student actually does stimulate something in the teacher. Either it's a challenging question or it probes deeper. And then the teacher will have to think about it and shift and change accordingly to try to answer that question. So in other words, there could be a state where something is being transmitted, but it's not affected by the recipient. And then there's a place where the recipient does affect. This is what Maisa Tachtenim in Malchus. Malchus is impacted by the Maisa Tachtenim to the point that its hashpah is relevant. So there's going back to the teacher could be teaching because he wants to teach, not because the student asked him to teach. He is in a mode that he wants to teach. But then there are times that a teacher may not be in that mode, but the students can stimulate him by either, like we learned earlier about Rashbi, through their praises and compliments, or their need that causes the teacher to say, you know what, I see there's a need, so I'll teach. He's been stimulated by that. So there's a state where he's beyond them, even though there's ashpah coming from him, and there's a state where he's affected by that. That in Ruchnius, in Kabbalistic terms, is Malchus of Atzilus. Is this Shoshana that colors change according commensurate to Maisa Tachtenim. Now he's going to continue to explain that this too, in Malchus, there's also levels. There's Malchus, how it's above that level of change, and there's Malchus as it comes in the state of Islapsus. That's the next section. So I think I'll stop here. I just want to see. I don't want to stop in the middle of a... Yeah. Let's stop here. The next step he's going to talk about how Malchus comes a slapsus into Biy'a. There's Malchus as it's still, you can still see the 10th sphere of Atzilus. So Malchus is going to be an interface between Atzilus and Biy'a, between non-shinui to shinui. So Malchus is going to become now a very critical piece in the connection between these two realities. The Ani Hashem Le'Shanisi of Atzilus, even Midas of Atzilus, and the Shanisi as Malchus starts manifesting and relating to Biy'a. And that's where the Malachim come into play, as we're going to discuss in the next class. I think here's a good place to stop. The bottom of 1228. I keep saying 1428. Page 1428. But I'll take any questions. And yeah, very, okay. This is becoming very, I think, very organized, step by step. Any questions? Okay. So we'll stop the class here. Let's stop the recording here. Bottom of page